Okay. So yeah, I was going to go ahead and cover the top 10 common violations. I'm going to cover the top 10 violations for 2019. The reason I'm going to go over 2019 is, well, we still have a few weeks left of 2020. And all these violations, these are all calculated from the inspections that are done throughout the state. So the county ag commissioners across California, all the inspections their staff does. Any investigations that are conducted related to, pesticide illness investigations or drifts or exposures, any violations that result from that. All that information comes to DPR at the end of the year. It actually takes about a month past the end of the year. And then that information is all, tabulated and they determine what the most common violations were. So usually the information for the current year comes out about March of the following year. So 2020s will come out in about March of 2021. But I've been with the department for going on 12 years. And in my experience, the top 10 doesn't really change too much. Their order might change, but the actual top 10 don't really change. I don't know whether that's really a good or a bad thing. But it's always a good thing to cover all of them. No one requirement is necessarily more important than another because they're all there to protect. They're all designed to help protect employees or handlers of pesticides, but also to protect the public and the environment. So these regulations revolve around safety for employees. The applicators are also responsible for public safety. So, that's the main idea behind these regulations. Because it stands to reason that handlers have the highest rate of pesticide-related job injuries. These are people that are handling pesticides on potentially daily basis, in their work. They're also handling pesticides that aren't necessarily handled by the general public, not on a regular basis. So, there's a lot of regulations developed to, help protect people using pesticides as well. And the handlers, have a responsibility, and some of those responsibilities, I have some listed here, the specific pesticides being used, how to read labels, PPE requirements, pesticide safety regulations applicable to any activity they may be performing, whether that's mixing, loading, or actually making the application. Not to give away any of the top 10 too soon, but this is all part of training that is necessary for people to handle pesticides, which handler training does make the top 10. So to kind of jump right into it, a lot of times people start, with the 10 and go in ascending order to number 1. But, being that, this one is particularly conflict with labeling has been the number 1 common violation for the last several years I've seen. I want to maybe, go to the top, go in a descending order. So, we can try and, address these up front. Conflict with labeling, that is the number 1 common violation for 2019. The actual regulation or the definition of conflict with labeling is right there. It's the use of any pesticide shall not conflict with labeling registered, which is delivered with the pesticide. So anytime you buy a pesticide from a licensed California dealer, that label that comes with it is required to be followed, and no mixing or loading or applicating should conflict with that. Possibly the reason why this tends to be the number 1 common violation is this is just an example of one label. This is, my slides here are just bits and pieces of it. It goes well beyond 30 pages, but there's a lot of information in a pesticide label. And, as you use pesticides, you're aware that there's many different factors. It's the number 1 mitigating document that you have in the field and when using a pesticide. This is where you're going to find what the active ingredient is, what the signal word is. It's going to tell you the routes of exposure. So different pesticide active ingredients have different routes of exposure, whether that be inhalation, dermal absorption, things of that nature. And with that, it's determined what the PPE requirements are. Every pesticide label has, its own unique PPE requirements. There are also additional regulation PPE requirements that I will go into. But this is where we check to see what's required by the label. Everybody's required to follow the PPE requirements that are on the label. That includes employers, owners and operators. Everyone must follow the label. It's also going to tell you, where you can apply this pesticide, to what use sites you can apply and at what rates. You can go under the rate, but you can never exceed the rate that's on the label. That's part of the labeling that's registered, and it states on all labels, it's a violation of federal law to, use this label inconsistent with it. So I just want to kind of point out that, there's a lot going on in the label as we're aware, and maybe, that leaves room for a variety of different scenarios that could lead to a violation, which it might be a violation of another regulation, but would also in turn possibly be a violation of the label. So that is the number one common violation. And it kind of, as I was stating, violations of this can lead into other violations. That would bring us to number two, which also I think has been consistent for the last several years, is personal protective equipment. And as I said at the beginning, I don't think any one regulation is more important than the other, but there's some that I really like to emphasize, and PPE is definitely one I really emphasize. I mean, this is the barrier that you're wearing to protect yourself from coming in contact with a pesticide, a possibly dangerous chemical. And this is, mitigating, your exposure and helping to prevent any possible illness that you might, experience should you come in contact with it. And there's a lot of different types of PPE. PPE is going to be found on the label. It could be required by a restricted materials permit. And it's also, possible that could be by regulation. There's a couple PPE regulation requirements that I'll point out that are in addition to labeling PPE, and I'll go over those in a minute. But it's the employer's responsibility to provide employees handling pesticides, with all the proper protective equipment. That also includes anybody who's doing early entry into a treated area. So if the restricted entry interval, the REI, has not expired and somebody's going in that area, the label will state what early entry PPE must be worn. It's the employer's responsibility to make sure that the PPE is inspected daily and is clean. You need to start with clean PPE each day, and repair any worn or damaged PPE. Because I've worked on a lot of different investigations with the counties and illness investigations. And in my experience, I would never suggest anybody handle pesticides without proper PPE. But I've seen that when PPE is not worn correctly, it can almost create a bigger hazard, in the sense that people might have a little more feeling of safety wearing the PPE, but if they're wearing it inappropriately, they open themselves up. They're a little bit more relaxed when handling the pesticides. So it's extremely important that employees understand how to properly wear PPE and know what the limitations of that PPE is. It's also the employer's responsibility to, provide clean or wash contaminated PPE, and to ensure that employees do not take contaminated PPE home. We don't want anybody, an employee mistakenly taking contaminated PPE home, and potentially it gets mixed in the wash with the family's, wash, or wearing PPE into their home, because any pesticides on the outside of that PPE can contaminate, other areas that come in contact with it. So these are employees' responsibilities. These are employers' responsibilities for the employee. So getting into the various types of PPE, the first two I'm going to go over, if they're required by the label, then they must be worn. But in addition to the label, if any employee is loading or mixing or applying by hand or ground rig, they're required to there's a couple regulation PPE requirements that kick in. So the first one is protective eyewear. So again, if the label requires it, then yes, eyewear is required. If the label doesn't require eyewear, but you have an employee that is mixing and loading pesticides or applying by hand or ground rig, then they are required to have eye protection. And the eye protection, there's a standard rating on it, ANSI Z87. You will find that stamped on the arm or somewhere on the eye protection. This is in line with OSHA requirements. And, you know, personally myself, I'm working around my home and stuff wearing eye protection. I've noted going to the hardware store to get eye protection. Most of them already have the Z87 standard. But just be aware that you do need to make sure, you know, in that your reading glasses or sunglasses do not meet the Z87 standard. It needs to be form-fitting to the brow and face, you know, to provide protection so you don't get any splashback, you know, down in the eye or something of that nature. The next PPE that is also in addition, or has an additional regulation set to it, is chemical resistant gloves. So if you are looking at the label and it requires chemical resistant gloves, it will specify what gloves must be worn. There is a minimum on chemical resistant gloves. It's 15 mils. And this down here in the right corner, this key card, you can find these at your county ag commissioner's office. You know, we provide that to them, and it's a handy card to kind of, some labels follow along this label code of A through H, and then it will, you know, this card will tell you what materials will satisfy that cat or that labeling code. But again, if the label doesn't require chemical resistant gloves to be worn, but an employee is wearing, or I mean, employees handling pesticides, you know, loading or mixing, applying by hand again, or ground rig, then the regulation kicks in and they have to wear chemical resistant gloves. There are a lot of different gloves out there, you know, that we've seen, and just to let you know, all these photos that I'm showing, these are all taken from inspections that people through county ag commissioner staff have taken, you know, in the course of their work. So these are all photos directly from inspections that they've done in the field. And as I stated a moment ago, that there's a minimum of 15 mils, you know, for chemical resistant gloves. So just a couple gloves that do not meet the requirements are like these gloves here, these ones that have, you know, they're cotton on top and have the plastic coating on the palm. Because as you can see in this photo, you know, somebody might think that they're being safe, but it's almost acting like a sponge. It's saturating and holding that there. So as I mentioned before, you know, I would never suggest anybody ever use pesticides without the proper PPE. But if you kind of think about it this way, that if somebody was barehanded and they got pesticides on their hand, probably one of their first instincts would be to go wash their hands. But in a case like this, where you're not wearing the proper PPE, that person might think that they're being safe and protected, when in fact, you know, as you can see on that person's fingers, is that, you know, it's just soaked in and they're wearing those all day without, you know, washing or decontaminating themselves, and potentially creating a worse situation for themselves. Additionally, flocked gloves are not acceptable. Gloves that have, you know, you get pesticides down inside, you know, those probably should be replaced. You know, you don't want your hands, you know, sitting in there encased with any pesticides. You know, I've worn these gloves myself. You know, your hands get sweaty and stuff. It might make for you know, worse absorption in that manner, you know, so make sure that you're wearing clean gloves. Down there on the right corner, those like mechanic gloves or what we might call like, you know, surgical gloves and stuff, those do not meet the requirement. They are too thin. There is an exception to be able to use those gloves for very limited certain circumstances. So I believe like if you needed to adjust a tractor nozzle or something like that, you could use these gloves for up to about 10 or 15 minutes and then they have to be disposed of. But these are not a replacement for the 15 mil chemical resistant gloves. So these are the two main PPE requirements that also have additional regulations around them. Again, and here's just some photos. And it's unfortunate it's a little too far away, but you know, these are photos in the field where, you know, these gentlemen were applying, or at least one was applying. He wasn't wearing any gloves. I think a case here where they weren't wearing gloves or eye protection. I think one of them actually had a pair of leather gloves, which again don't meet the requirements and can actually absorb pesticides. Most of these other regulations most of these other PPE requirements are things that you're going to find on the label. It would still be a violation of the regulation in the sense that the regulation states that you must wear any labeling required PPE, but typically chemical or resistant footwear, aprons and stuff that I'll go over, those are going to be label driven. So, you know, if the label requires chemical resistant footwear, it must be worn. That doesn't mean, you know, leather work boots or you know, things of that nature. They're chemical resistant boots. There's also chemical resistant shoes out there. There's chemical resistant like booties that can be slipped over your shoes. Those do meet the requirements if chemical resistant footwear is indeed required. If the label requires a hood or a wide brim chemical resistant hat, something of that nature, you know, then that's going to be required to be worn. It's the employer's responsibility to make sure the employees have all this available. But again, that's going to be something that you'll find on the label. There is another regulation PPE requirement, and that's specific that when employees are handling pesticides with the signal word danger or warning, except when using fumigants, that they are required to wear coveralls. And again, so that, you know, if you're handling anything danger or warning as an employee, you know, coveralls are going to be required to be worn. And as I, you know, mentioned a couple times, in you know, PPE not worn correctly or contaminated PPE can create a very big hazard. So this photo on the left, these yellow Tyveks, in the morning, those Tyveks started out completely white, like the gentleman on the right. All that yellow is pesticides. That's how contaminated that PPE is. So that just leads me into a quick story of when I first started in the current position I'm in enforcement many years ago. I was asked to assist a county with an illness investigation. And what the investigation was is it was a national forest campground. So it took place kind of on federal land, but being that the person ended up at the hospital, the county and CDPR gets notified to follow up and investigate. They were spraying a campground for pine beetle, and they hired a pest control business to come out and spray the trees. And so they put a blue dye into the pesticide mix so that they could assure that they're getting full coverage of the tree. They also put a federal employee, being that this was federal land, out there to spot check and make sure that, you know, the application was going according to what the agency had wanted. By all, the federal employee started out the day, you know, with the proper PPE and white coveralls. But by all accounts and statements that came about in the investigation, that person's coveralls by lunchtime of the first day were completely blue because of the dye. The pesticides were raining back down on that person. That person was taking those coveralls home every evening, which is a violation. And then that person was putting on those same coveralls every morning to go back out to the job. So, you know, they were not starting with clean PPE each morning. This went on for most of a week. And the pesticide they were using was a cholinesterase inhibitor. So if anybody's ever used any organophosphates or carbamates, you realize, you know that there's a lot of additional regulations surrounding those pesticides that are cholinesterase inhibitors. You have to get a cholinesterase test with a medical provider to start a baseline, because this pesticide builds up in your bloodstream over time. You know, the more you're exposed to it, the more it builds up in your bloodstream. And it's actually a neuroinhibitor and can cause brain damage. So this person putting on these blue coveralls that were contaminated every morning was just immediately, you know, re-exposing themselves to the pesticide, and then going out to the job and getting, additional exposure. So after several days, it built up in their bloodstream enough that one morning when they were getting up to go to work, they collapsed. Fortunately, there was family there, and they rushed into the hospital. That person survived and was okay, very fortunate. And but they spent some time in the hospital, and it was just an example of when wearing PPE incorrectly, what a hazard that can create for a person. And in this case, it was fortunate that everybody came out okay, but it was extremely hazardous situation. So heavily contaminated PPE needs to be replaced. The employees need to be provided with clean and in good repair PPE. So good repair, the person on the right, those holes, it'd probably be time to replace that PPE. I mean, duct tape is not going to fix that. Chemical resistant aprons. So again, this is required when it's called for by the label. Most often I see this required when mixing and loading on the label. There's lots of labels out there. It's not to say that there couldn't be one where it requires it when applying, but typically I've seen this more in the mix and load section. It has to be, cover the body from mid-chest to the knees. And like in this photo, I mean, this stuff is chemical resistant. It's not chemical proof. So, that is heavily contaminated. It's probably time to get a new pair or new apron in that situation. Just be aware, these also fall in line with OSHA regulations. Just be aware that, PPE, this is heavy material, and, I've spent a lot of time out in rice fields in the middle of the summer. I know how hot it can get, and people are working, which just, it's being very physical, and then you're wearing PPE on top of that, people can overheat. So, just be aware that, to watch for that employees understand, to watch for heat exhaustion. There's regulation that if, the ambient temperature exceeds 80 degrees during daylight hours or 85 during nighttime, employees, might need to be wearing a cool suit when, handling, certain pesticides or are required to wear certain PPE. Again, this just kind of falls in line with some OSHA requirements. And then there's a couple photos here of out in the field, the gentleman on the left, his PPE looks pretty good. He's he's got a half-face respirator, goggles, and a face shield. So he's probably going above and beyond on that. The only thing I would comment is, PPE has to be worn correctly or else it's not really serving its intended purpose. So those coveralls need to be zipped all the way up. I've seen this a lot in the field. It gets hot, and I understand people kind of, might zip it down to mid-chest or something to cool off a bit. But, that's opening it back up for potential pesticide exposure. The person on the right, I think their PPE, looks good. The only thing I would point out is the gloves they are wearing are like those kind of mechanic or surgical gloves. Those are not meeting the 15 mil requirements. There are some exemptions to wearing PPE. When these exemptions apply or kick in, PPE can be reduced. However, that PPE needs to be immediately available to the person. And these exemptions mainly kick in when somebody is applying from an enclosed cab or when they're using, say, vehicle mounted or towed equipment with the spray nozzles located below and pointed downward. So below the employee and pointed downward. Cases where applying vertebrate pest control baits, using long-handled implements, things of that nature, PPE can be reduced. But again, that PPE must be immediately available, and it must be kept, free of contaminants. So, that picture of the Tupperware container from the right doesn't have to be, exactly that, but it, placed a sealed bag, a Ziploc bag, or some kind of means of keeping the PPE clean and safe from contaminants. Or if the PPE is worn and contaminated, it needs to be put in some kind of container that will, not contaminate the cab when you bring it, into the cab or something of that nature. Additionally, there are some exemptions when using closed mix systems. If you're using a closed mix system, PPE can be reduced. However, the eye protection is always required to be worn when using a closed mix system. And the reason for that is, you know, they're under a lot of pressure. And so, you know, there's always a possibility that a hose could blow out or a coupling breaks loose or something, you know, so want to make sure we're protecting our eyes. You know, a number of years ago, I had an eye injury myself, and, you know, I'm extremely grateful and fortunate that my vision came back and I didn't lose it. But I tell you what, when, you know, when that happens, I mean, it's just immediate. You realize what a life-changing event this potentially is. So, you know, definitely want to make sure not only are we protecting ourselves from exposure in all manners, but I mean, you know, wearing eye protection to protect our eyes. So again, closed mix systems, when in use, you can reduce some PPE, say, you know, maybe that's required by the label, say coveralls and things like that, but you still must wear eye protection. And this photo here might be a little difficult to see, but this is a case where somebody was working in an enclosed cab, so they could reduce their PPE. You can kind of see peeking out there in the corner of the seat, the gloves and the coveralls and stuff. So they had their PPE immediately available. They just, you know, working in enclosed cab, they didn't have to wear it while working from the enclosed cab. PPE was in a bag there, but it had been taken out to show the inspector. But if you look real close, the problem is with that open door. If you look at the window and you look at the window on the opposite side, this person was making the application with the windows completely open. That is not an enclosed cab at that point. You know, if they closed the windows, it would have been okay. But, you know, closed cab means enclosed, not with the windows open. So, you know, I realize I spent a bit of time on PPE. You know, it is the #2 common violation. And I do really, like I said, like to emphasize it because, you know, it is meant to protect, you know, everybody or users of pesticides, you know. So, you know, move along a little bit quicker through some of these. The #3 common violation was a pest control businesses registered. So every county a pest control business works in must register with the county ag commissioner in addition to registration with CDPR. So just because you're registered in Sacramento County doesn't mean you can start working in El Dorado or Placer County. You would have to register with that commissioner as well. And there's a few bullets of what the commissioner, you know, will require. Name and address, types of pesticide, or I mean, number of units that are being used, and so on. Emergency medical care posting. So this is, you know, required to be posted or displayed at the use site. It is going to be 3 pieces of information. I have bullets there: the name of the facility where somebody can get emergency medical care, the address of that location, and the telephone number. 911 does not meet this requirement. Okay, so I realize a lot of people in emergency will still call 911, but when putting out this posting or this display, 911 doesn't meet that. It has to have these 3 pieces of information. And when it says it needs to be planned for in advance, mainly what that's saying is that's going to be an employee's an employer's responsibility. And what that's saying is, you know, in my experience, all emergency rooms are capable of handling a pesticide emergency or pesticide exposure. Sometimes we've encountered people that might use, you know, like the local urgent care or walk-in clinic. A lot of times those aren't places that are equipped to handle a pesticide exposure. So if that's something that the employer wants to use as the, you know, a medical care facility, they would need to reach out to that facility first to ensure that they can in fact handle a pesticide exposure. You said it needs to be displayed. You know, there can be various ways. You know, people have written it in grease pen on their equipment. These stickers are fine, you know, but again, just like 911, that number there, poison control emergency telephone number, it's great information, but it does not replace the need for the most local medical facility name and address of the place and telephone number. But again, these stickers and grease pens and all this doesn't meet the requirements if it's not completed. So that sticker right there, that I've seen this a lot, you know, it's great that they're on there, but if you don't fill out the information on there specific to your local, environment, it's not serving its purpose. The grease pen, it might need to be touched up from time to time, or like the photo on the right, you know, they typed it up and it was great and put it in that little plate, but you know, time it's oxidated. You know, nobody has a wrench to open that up in the event of emergency. And again, you know, on the right's another side where they filled out all this information on the sticker, but they neglected to fill in the doctor's information. The one on the left, I mean, it was really great. They stenciled that on there, so it's permanently on there and won't really fade easily. There is a emergency dignity health facility, I think in like downtown Sacramento, but this was out in Yolo County, and Dignity Health has these satellite offices that operate a bit like these walk-in clinics, like, you know, these local emergency, or not emergency, but yeah, the walk-in clinics. The thing was with these satellite offices is they could handle a pesticide illness, but they were only open from 8 to 5. So that is meeting the requirement if that application is only taking place from 8 to 5. But as we know, you know, with farming or structural pest control, I mean, these happen at a lot of different hours throughout the day. So anytime outside of that 8 to 5, this would not be a viable place to go seek medical attention. Service container labeling. So I'm going to try and speed up a little bit because I know I'm getting short on time, but service container labeling, again, there's 3 pieces of information that are required to be on service container labeling. Anytime you mix and load a pesticide or have, you know, pesticide in a service container and you leave your property, so you mix and load at the warehouse and you drive, you know, a mile or several miles down to the use site, you must have service container labeling. If you mix and load on site and you use all the application on site and you rinse out your tanks on site, you do not need service container labeling. But any contaminated equipment leaving that site, going out into public roads and off, you know, the property you're working on, you would need this service container labeling. The 3 pieces of information that are needed on service container labeling is the name and address of persons responsible for the container, the identity of the pesticide in the container, and the signal word danger, warning, or caution in accordance with the label. And I emphasize that accordance with the label because a number of years ago, the World Health Organization got together and made what they called global harmonization for the SDSs. And in that, they got rid of the caution word. So there's only danger and warning for SDSs. SDSs are not reviewed or approved by CDPR. I'm not sure who handles that. So again, you're going to use the signal word on the label. SDSs are required by regulation to be, you know, available at certain places, but the label again is the registered labeling. That is where you're going to find the signal word. And down there on the right, you can see that yellow circle. I've seen that a lot where people make these laminated tags, or I've seen even, you know, metal tags that are stamped. You know, especially like structural guys that are using like the B&G sprayers, and they you know, swap out different pesticides. They can just clip on whatever pesticide they're using at the time. There's a number of ways to you know, identify this. Application specific display information. So this is the information that employees, you know, whether it be handlers or field workers, even if you're using a field labor contractor, so an FLC, it's still the property operator, the employer's responsibility to make sure this information is out there. You know, all those bullets is the information that is required to be on the application specific display. The key thing to this regulation is it must be readily available, or must be available for people to see, or for these employees or field workers to review without having to ask for it. You know, US EPA developed this regulation and made some changes a few years ago. And the idea is, you know, is that if somebody were to have to request to see this information, they might feel a little hesitant to ask for that information, but it's a right to know what they're potentially being exposed to. And where it kicks in is when people are working in a treated field. And what a treated field consists of is that is any use site or any field that's had a pesticide application made to it within the last 30 days, plus the restricted entry interval, so the REI. The REI is going to be found on the label. They vary. I've seen them from, REIs until dry all the way up to like 7 days. So say it's 48 hours is the REI. That would be 30 plus the REI. That'd be 32 days. This is considered a treated field. Anytime, that's why this information has to be displayed that whole time. Once it's no longer a treated field, it doesn't have to be displayed. But as I mentioned, US EPA made some additions to this regulation a number of years ago. This information has to be kept a record of for 2 years. So again, I've seen a number of ways this is met. Could be, kept in a binder in a break room. I've seen whiteboards in the past where they would write it and just erase the dry whiteboard, when it was no longer treated field. However, with the change of keeping these records for 2 years, somebody would need to transcribe that. But, the information on there is going to be, the site treated, the identification of the field treated, the dates and times of the application, REI, product names. So there's a number of different information that's required, a copy of the SDS. There's a number of templates at DPR that you can use for different things. A lot of stuff I'll go over, the templates are available for anyone to use. If you go to DPR's website, and at the top, there's a tab for programs, and you hover over it, and it will drop down different programs. If you go to the worker health and safety portion of that, you can find a lot of templates. You don't have to use the templates, but, they're hopefully there to make, kind of easier explain what information needs to be presented. This isn't the actual template I believe we have on our website, but just an example of things, different things we've seen in the field, how people comply with this. Again, this is somebody made up their own template. I think the issue with this one is there's no start or end times of the application. So again, while it's a treated field, this must be displayed for field workers or handlers to be able to see what they're potentially being exposed to working in those fields. Handler training, number 7. So I mentioned at the beginning that this one was actually number 10 last year. It's moved up a bit. There's 23 topics to train on. And part of those, like the ones I mentioned at the beginning, the applicator's responsibility, when making an application, the limitations or needs for PPE, the hazards of the pesticides, the routes of exposure. Each pesticide has its own unique routes of potential exposure. This is another template we have available, and they made this a couple years ago. I think they did a fantastic job with it. It really just walks you right through all the things that need to be covered. This is not to be confused with the individual handler train or the individual handler training, but this is your written program. So those are 2 different regulations there. And your written program here, this covers, you just fill in the information specific to your operation. What you use to train them on. The A series, which I'll go over in a moment, can be used. And then you just go through those different topics there. The reason why handler training might be one of the more common violations we see is when county staff go in to do an inspection, a headquarters inspection, they're going to request these records to take a look at. And it might not be that the handlers weren't necessarily trained, but these documents oftentimes aren't completely filled out. So I've seen it where those yes, no's, like only a handful of those are circled or filled out. That doesn't tell the inspector and, any additional information. I mean, were the other topics not covered? Do they not pertain? So why these sometimes fall into being a common violation is just, these records need to be completely filled out in order to satisfy the regulation and, meet the purpose for which they were developed. As I mentioned a moment ago, the A series, this falls into number 8 of common violations. Hazard communication for field workers. I think A9 is for the field workers. There's an A8 for handlers. It's a lot of similar information, but there's differences because of the different tasks being performed. This needs to be displayed at the work site and all permanent decontamination facilities servicing 11 or more field workers. The A9 is AA8 can be at the central location. It's available in both English and Spanish, and I think it's also been translated into Hmong and Punjabi. It's all available at DPR's website. People can go and print these out. It's required in certain, to be available or displayed. A big reason why this falls into being a common violation is somewhat similar to handler training that I mentioned, is as you can see, the copy on the right, there's information that needs to be filled out. Sorry, this is just a photo of, this isn't a permanent decontamination facility, but oftentimes, it's available at the use site. Just an example of seeing it posted on the board. But as you see here, there's several parts where it has to be filled out, and this is specific to the operation that's, or the use site where things are happening. Information again on where to go get medical attention, where to find the application specific display. If it's not filled out, again, it's not meeting its purpose, because this is just kind of a generic template here with useful information, but it has to be filled out by the employer. And so I've seen this a number of times where, in this case, they put it in a binder, they put it in these plastic sleeves, which is great. It keeps it from getting contaminated or worn, but they didn't fill out the information. I've also seen cases where, unfortunately somebody went and laminated the whole sheet and posted it, and that's great, but they didn't fill out that information. So it's not meeting the requirement. Decontamination. So there's several things that are required to be in a decontamination kit. It's going to be sufficient water for single-use towels and soap for routine washing, anytime there's possible contact with pesticides. Also, one change of coveralls needs to be available with that decontamination kit. The water has to be a quality and of temperature that will not cause injury or illness when it is, comes in contact with the eyes or possibly swallowed. And I'll touch on that a bit more in a moment. But the kit, it has to be, all the items have to be kept together in the same area. You can't have soap on one side of the field and water on the other. It has to be no more than a quarter mile from the nearest point of vehicle access from the handlers. In addition to the decontamination kit, if you are handling a pesticide or mixing and loading a pesticide that requires eye protection, then the handler must have 1 pint of water for emergency eye flushing. So again, that is if the label requires eye protection, then they need to have 1 pint. And the whole thing of that is say somebody gets pesticides in their eye, they have that 1 pint of water to rinse their eyes to allow them to get to the decontamination kit to further decontaminate and then be taken to get medical attention. Because, even though it can't be further than a quarter mile, trying to run a quarter mile blind, is extremely difficult to find the kit. And here's an example, where, the items were kept together. The water for washing, the 1 pint is for the emergency eye flush. The water for washing or decontaminating is a minimum of 3 gallons of water per handler at the beginning of the day, the beginning of the workday. For field workers, it's going to be 1 gallon per field worker. So just be aware of that. And hand sanitizing gels and liquids or wet towelettes do not meet these requirements. Just a couple quick examples of issues we've seen in the field. You want to keep these decontamination items, free from contaminants. So in that Ziploc bag on the right is fine, except there's a big tear you can see in the corner of the bag. The water tank there on the back of this tractor, that that was plenty of water for more than 3 gallons for decontaminating. But I mean, look at the location of it. Anybody trying to use that water would have to climb over the spray nozzles here, thus potentially or most likely contaminating themselves further. Again, the picture on the left, that's 2.5 gallons. The minimum at the start of the day is 3 gallons per handler. So if they had 2 of these in one handler, that would meet the requirement. But unfortunately, just this one is a 1/2 gallon shy. The photo on the right, I just want to point out for eye wash, emergency eye wash, I'm not going to discourage anybody from getting a designated bottle of eye wash or some kind of eye saline wash. That's completely fine. But I just want to point out that it's not required to be that. You can use any you can use your regular bottle of drinking water if need be. I might go to my local Costco. They have a vending machine at the front with Kirkland water. It's a quarter for a bottle of water. And it's 1 pint. That can be emergency eye wash. It doesn't have to be any specific saline solution or anything. If you want to get fancy and use Fuji water or Evian or something, that works too, as long as it's a pint. I just always caution people, because I've seen it plenty of times. If you have regular drinking water, a bottle like that for your emergency eye wash, and you have one for drinking, maybe take a Sharpie and write eye wash on one of them. It's not required, but what I've seen is, somebody's working away throughout the day and they're drinking their drinking water, which is the same type of bottle as their eye wash. An inspector comes along and asks to see their eye wash. Well, they've accidentally drinking both of them, so they have no eye wash. The other issue with that bottle, if you take a close look, is it's 4 ounces. So if somebody had 3 of those on them, that would make a pint. 16 ounces is a pint, and so that would meet the requirement, but just the one single bottle does not. And real quick on mixing and loading. So the US EPA kind of made additions to mixing and loading. Again, this is if the label requires eye protection. Then at the mixed load site, and this is what it reads, there must be there is an immediate employee access to at least one system capable of delivering water at a rate of 0.4 gallons per minute for at least 15 minutes, or at least 6 gallons of water in containers suitable for providing a gentle eye flush for about 15 minutes. Again, I'm not going to discourage anybody from wanting to go out and get an eye flush station like there on the right. But I mean, if you have a hose, a garden hose to the well or something, if you have 6 gallons in a jug of water that somebody could pour into somebody else's eyes, for 15 minutes to flush, those will meet the requirements. We often get asked questions, can you use the nurse tank? And you can use a nurse tank as long as it has the appropriate backflow prevention. So like that on the right, that keeps it, because this water is being used also to mix and load pesticides to a different tank. But this is clean water in this tank. That's just where we point out, temperatures that are suitable not to cause injury. This photo is like down in Fresno. That tank sitting out in the sun all day, that water can get extremely hot. And also, you don't want to cause injury. A lot of the stuff is, it's a lot of weight of water on there, or it's under pressure. Somebody sticks their eye right up to that nozzle on the right and opens it up, it could cause further damage to the eye. So just be aware of that. But as long as it has a proper backflow prevention checks, a nurse tank could be, because there's plenty of water in there. Okay, so the last regulation or a common violation is labeling available at the use site. The label has to be available at the use site whenever a pesticide is being mixed or loaded or used or handled. It has to be the registered label that allows that pesticide to be used where it's being used at. I see it a lot of times, like in that photo where it's taped to the nurse tank. That's fine. That actually kind of helps meet a couple of the requirements of your service container labeling. As long as they stencil on who's responsible for that equipment and they have that label there, they've met all the requirements of service container labeling. Issues I've seen with that is sometimes people just tear off the front page and tape it on there. I mean, that still works maybe for the service container labeling, but you have to have the complete label at the use site or the mix and load site. And the thing that I wanted to point out on this is we get a lot of questions on, can we use or can people use electronic devices for a label? That's fine, but just a couple words of caution on that. I worked in registration for a number of years, so I've registered a lot of labels for use in California. And in that time, I realized that labels are, they're all registered through the US EPA first for use in the United States. But after that, it gets into marketers to do a lot of different things with labels. So it might be the same pesticide you're using here in California, but there might be a different variation of the label for Idaho because they're trying to hit certain niche markets. So when you go online, you have to be sure that you are using the label that is registered for use in California. The label that you receive from a licensed California dealer will be the label that you're allowed to use. But going online, there's the potential for getting a label that's not the registered one. The other issue is if you're using an electronic device, people work in a large geographic range, it could be that you don't have cell phone reception or reception to download it, or you don't have a full battery. And I have been on inspections where when somebody was asked to see the label, they brought out, their electronic device, and they were only able to bring up, the first page of a 30-page label. That doesn't meet the requirement. So that is the top 10 for 2019. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Dennis, for that great presentation. Aubrey, there's actually some questions for you.
Okay.
And so Aubrey, go ahead and take over.
Alrighty. There's a question about coveralls, if they should be tucked into the rubber boots or be over the rubber boots?
That question comes up a number of times. CDPR does not have any specific requirement to that in the regulation. I know a lot of people think that it might be better to have them outside of the boot so you don't potentially have any pesticides, whether they're granular or liquid, running down into your boot, because then you're potentially standing in a pesticide all day. But our regulations don't necessarily address that specifically.
Alrighty. And then you mentioned the templates. One question was, can we get a link to the templates? And maybe you could just go over again how to get to those templates.
Yeah, so I can send Sydney a link if she can provide that later to people. But basically, if you just go to California Department of Pesticide Regulation, you go to our website. You just Google that, and you'll come to our website. And at the top, there's several tabs, and one of the tabs will say Programs. And when you hover over the programs, it drops down into there's registration, enforcement, environmental monitoring. The one you're looking for is worker health and safety. And you go to that tab, or you go to that one, you click on it, and that will open up information. There's a world of information on our website. I recommend people, you can spend a lot of time looking through it, but the worker health and safety area, and then you'll be able to go through different areas in there and find these templates for handler training.
Great. And then there's a question. It says, I have one contiguous 200-acre farm. I keep the A series, including the A9, at our central shop. Does it need to be displayed anywhere else?
So for the handlers, let me back up, for including field workers, if they're starting their day at a central location. So if you have field workers and they all start at the central location, which might be the shop, then yes, it just only needs to be there, but also any permanent decontamination facilities servicing 11 or more. But oftentimes you'll see where somebody hires an FLC, they might start their day out in the field. If that's the case, then it has to be displayed out in the field. So again, if all your employees or handlers, field labor are starting at a central location, which is your shop, then it only would need to be displayed there.
Okay, great.
We have 2
and
more
then,
minutes for questions.
yes, seems like there are 2 more here. Are the specimen labels on the CDMS or Agrian legal for PCAs to use to write recs?
So in my experience, they tend to be fairly up to date and accurate with the current registered labeling, but I can only attest to what is coming with the pesticide label. I'm not trying to disparage CDMS or Agrian by any means. It's just the only one I can really, confirm is the one that comes with the pesticide label when you buy it from a registered or licensed dealer, California dealer. You could also contact CDPR and request the stamp accepted label, but in my experience, Agrian tends to be fairly up to date. But again, I can't really recommend that is 100%.
Alrighty. And then, are employers the same as owners as far as who is ultimately responsible for following laws and regs?
Are employers the same as owners for? I'm not sure exactly what the intent of the question, because I'm thinking it could go a couple different ways. Sometimes owner operators have the question of, do they have to follow some of these regulations? A lot of these regulations are for employees. Those would be the ones that are called the 6700 series. Owner operators that are doing their own applications wouldn't necessarily have to follow those per se. However, there are some, if it's an egregious violation of something, there are general standards of care that could kick in. But everybody is responsible for following the label, whether you're owner, operator, employer, or employee. Everybody has to follow those. The other thing I could maybe think of what the question was asking is sometimes there's different scenarios on who owns the property, but who's actually employing people and running it. Who would actually be employing and running the operation? hiring the people and training them, they would generally be the responsible party. So if I just own a plot of land, but I'm leasing it out, somebody else is farming for me, that person I'm leasing to farming and doing all that, they would be the employer, the responsible party. But those lines can get a little fuzzy. There's a lot of different scenarios out there between, you know, vineyard maintenances, you know, the different farm companies, labor companies, and stuff like that. So each situation needs to be kind of looked at individually.
Okay,
All
that's
right,
all the
and-
time we have for questions.
Oh, okay.
Dennis, you can click on the Q&A at the bottom, and the last question will be there. And if you can answer directly, that'd be great before you go.
Okay.
Thank you so much for presenting today.